Sounds like they could also stay in a lot for conversations.
Yeah, that's the hope is that we get something's perfect. Then we will have that's the state we have happened. The election of the part is 0.6% local or not.
Right.
And other still not.
It seems like those city councilors kind of connect with the voters tag and say, what are you doing? This is all.
How many states aside from Mississippi have that denial of service Secretary of State?
Yeah, but wait,
Really?
yes.
So I was getting ready to vote yesterday, and I wanted to pull up the ballot because we had all those nonpartisan judicial races, and I wanted to make sure I had people, usually the ones that I couldn't pull up the ballot. And I was like, what's wrong with my internet? What's going on here? And finally, after probably 10 minutes, I got it to come up, and I didn't think anything of it. And then, like at 9 o'clock last night, I saw just the Secretary of State denial.
Yeah, there was one campaign that was this morning that was they said that they had an outside
See, North Carolina, I lived there. I was at Appalachian State. And their public voter registration was really comprehensive. You just go in and put in like via America.com and have your affiliation and precinct and all of that stuff. And so I know the I guess in 2016 that was one of the ones that was really kind of attacked prior to the election because it had so much. Oh, nice.
Yeah, they're very good.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's not quite 4 o'clock, but I have a feeling we have a lot to talk about today, so let's go ahead and get started. Our panelists are all here. I'm so thankful to see all of you who've come out to join us in our conversation today about the midterm elections. My name is Melanie Lowing. I am the temporary director of the Institute for the Humanities, while our fabulous permanent director, Dr. Julia Osman, is out on sabbatical this semester. And I have the absolute privilege of introducing our panelists today who are joining us from departments across arts and sciences to lend their expertise to this conversation about what happened yesterday, what it means moving forward, and how we understand the current political developments that we're all living through in the United States. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, I'll bring up our moderator, and then we're going to have them reflect for just a couple of minutes on their reactions to yesterday's elections and the results that are continuing to return in before the moderator asks a handful of questions, and then we plan to open it up to the audience so that you all can ask any questions that you have of them as well. So first, we have Dr. Jessica Collier, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication. Jessica specializes in the study of political communication, particularly in terms of the influence of social media and misinformation on audiences. Dr. Kimberly Kelly is an associate professor of sociology and the director of the Gender Studies program here on campus. She studies the intersection of religion and reproductive politics and is also a leading expert on abortion activism in the United States. Dr. Leah Maravaki is an assistant professor of political science whose interdisciplinary work examines the mechanics of voting, voter education efforts, election misinformation, and the transparency and accessibility of election data. And Dr. Mike Potter is an associate professor of public administration and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Integrity. He brings to our panel research expertise in terrorist finance, ethics, and regulatory policy. And we're joined today by Dr. Brian Shoup, who is the department head and a professor of political science and public administration, and he's going to moderate today's discussion. And before I turn things over to him, I just want to say a sincere thank you to all of you for joining us And also to the College of Arts and Sciences for always supporting the Institute for the Humanities, and the Honors College for letting us use this fabulous space today for our event. So please join me in welcoming our panel and our moderator for our discussion of making sense of the midterms.
Thank you very much. As Dr. Lowen said, I want to thank everybody for being here. I appreciate the Institute for the Humanities as well as the Shackles Honors College. Obviously, last night's midterms were abnormal. It is typically the case in a midterm election for the party that is out of power, that is to say the party that is opposed to the president, to win on average about 40 seats in the House and to usually win at least 6 seats in the Senate. It is clear that that did not happen. We are still waiting for results that will complete the Nevada count. It's clear now Georgia will go to a runoff. There is an outside possibility that the Republican Party may take the Senate. I don't know if that's the case. Certainly, I think the case still that they will take the House, but most projections are looking at about a 4 to possibly 5 seat majority, which is incredibly small. To say that this is unprecedented given the relative unpopularity of the sitting president as well as extant problems with inflation and other policy concerns is an understatement. And that's what makes this such a fascinating midterm. The fact that it has been so deeply connected to broader questions about anxieties related to the health of our democratic republic makes it all the more interesting. And as such, I'm really happy that we have our panelists here today. So what I would first of all like to do is just go down the line and have everybody give their opening impressions. I think Dr. Maravaki put it best, what's your big key takeaway? And what I would like to do is actually maybe start with a political scientist who studies elections, election integrity, and issues pertaining to how state and local electoral policies function. We'll move on down the line. So Dr. Maravaki, please. And if you could use the microphone.
And just slide the buttons.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right? Yes. Thank you so much for Sue. Thank you for allowing. Great to be here. I have a question for everyone. How many of you voted yesterday? How many of you voted in person? How long did you wait in line? Not at all?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. So 30 minutes is supposed to be the worst wait time of the polls. I study elections and election administration. From an election administration perspective, the takeaway is that it was a very boring election and nothing abnormal about it overall. Voters were excited to vote. Some waited like longer than others, but to some extent this can be attributed to voter enthusiasm. People in specific states were very excited to be out there and vote for the preferred candidate, like states in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, with competitive elections. So elections were run smoothly. The biggest takeaway for me was that election officials deserve the Medal of Honor for the work they're doing. All workers, they are under-resourced, underpaid. They are dealing with harassment, which is stemming from misinformation about the stolen election in 2020. Another takeaway was that a lot of candidates who were running with a platform that the election of 2020 was stolen were not successful, which is a big success, which means that voters can call them off and they don't like what they hear. Persistent challenges always exist. Voters need to be informed, need to be able to access elections, and our system works very well. We have a very decentralized system of elections. We have over 8,000 election officials in jurisdictions that are running elections in their own different way, which makes it very difficult to hack the system. That said, there are persistent efforts to undermine the integrity of our elections and to instill distrust, which is why we need to be very careful where we get information, but make sure to thank your election official because they're doing the best they can to service you. That's it for me.
All right, Dr. Potter, you actually worked in Washington for a while. It's true. So you have a pretty hands-on opinion. What's your big takeaway?
So I, like Dr. Shoup said, I spent about 10 years in Washington, D.C. As a lobbyist. I worked for PAC, and then I also worked as a legislative employee for Joe Manchin for a little bit too. That was at the state level, not at the federal. Yeah, I think some of echoing what Dr. Maravaki said. My thoughts are this election, with apologies to Warren G. Harding, was a return to normalcy. I think it was abnormal because in a lot of ways it seemed more normal than elections we've had in a while. Even down to, and this has been kind of an interesting thing that has occurred, we've had gracious losers in both parties who have conceded and done the things that historically have helped people to be effective after the election. I think my big takeaway as just a former political operative was that that policy matters and candidate quality matters. And I think that also speaks a little bit to Dr. Maravaki's comments about people who maybe had statements about the previous election that calling the legitimacy into question. You saw a lot of those not get very far in the general election when they had to deal with voters from other parties. I think there's also another aspect of it that was a bit of a return to normalcy in that you see in states like Florida, Ron DeSantis and Brian Kemp in Georgia were pulling voters from the other party and were overperforming some of the senatorial elections. So I think that gives us a little bit of insight into that maybe our politics aren't quite as ideologically rigid as we think they are. So overall, I think it was a good election, and like Leah said, don't seem to be any major issues so far. Even some of the slow counting challenges that happened from the last one, obviously we know why that happened, mailing ballots because of COVID, but it just seems like it feels like it's kind of a more normal electoral process, which I think is good for everyone.
Dr. Collier, you're a political communication expert. You know more about how social media impacts these things. What are your takes on it?
Sure. I think my takeaways are going to echo a lot of what's been said already, and in particular, I'm going to focus on the misinformation communication. But the ultimate goal, of misinformation scholars to ensure that we have accurate information circulating in our political information environment. And I think yesterday, seeing that people who had previously espoused skepticism around the 2020 election results, or who had outright refused to certify those results, were not elected in those races is encouraging. I would also like to add some maybe cautious optimism surrounding that, because there are still races that have left to be called, or races where people did win who have espoused those false or dubious claims in the past. So maybe moving forward as we look to the next election cycle, as we like to do the day after the previous one, making sure that we're remaining vigilant around issues related to misinformation and false claims that get circulated in the political information environment, I think is especially important and something that we should continue to focus on.
Dr. Kelly, you're obviously the leading specialist on the issues of reproductive health, and what is your take on this?
Last week when Dr. Lowing asked me to participate in this panel, I did not think I would be up here saying what I'm about to say, but yesterday was a really good day for reproductive rights. And to set the stage a little bit, in June of this year, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which guaranteed at the federal level the right to legal abortion. By overturning Roe v. Wade, it returned control of abortion to the states, and pretty much immediately 14 states banned abortion, and another 12 are likely to do so. That means more than half of all U.S. states will have abortion bans in place. Dark days. But then, on the horizon, in August, the ruby red state of Kansas set the stage by voting to keep abortion legal, by rejecting an amendment to the state constitution that would have explicitly said there is no right to abortion. It wasn't close. It was 59 to 41% in Kansas, a deeply conservative state. It was the first state to vote on reproductive rights in any form since the Dobbs decision. And Kansas is surrounded by other states that have banned abortion. So patients are flooding in as far away as Texas, they're saying, as well as the states that ring it. Kansas is keeping, to some extent, abortion accessible for large swaths of the Midwest. At this point in time, pro-abortion rights groups and Democrats started hoping for a surge in the polls. And we did see astronomical increases in voter registration in both young people and women, two groups that are more likely to vote for pro-choice, pro-reproductive rights candidates. As we move into the election, to my delight and surprise, Kansas is not an anomaly. Voters are showing strong support for abortion rights, even in red states. 3 states enshrined the right to abortion in their state constitutions yesterday, and 2 additional states voted down laws or amendments that would have explicitly banned abortion. It wasn't close. The margins of success in these, or defeat of these other laws, ranged from 6 to 54 points. None of this was even close. So I think the elections have told us something very interesting about how the voters feel about reproductive rights, about women's reproductive autonomy, and I think it's telling us something pretty valuable about how to move forward with advancing abortion access in a context where we're not going to be able to approach that at the federal level for years, if not decades.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to do 3 questions from me, the moderator, for the panel, and then we're going to open it up to all of you out there so that you can make your inquiries to the experts that we've assembled. The first one is actually more oriented towards how we report or think about elections, and that has to do with polling. And one of the things that we've seen really since about 2012 has been questions and challenges to the accuracy of polls and their abilities to inform where the electorate is. And in several races, the polls appear to have been off. So I want to ask every one of you for your take on this, but I think, maybe Dr. Marabaki and perhaps Dr. Collier, you guys might have a little more, and also Dr. Potter. Is polling broken? And I don't have our actual polling expert, Dr. Steve Schaefer, here, and I can give you his answer, yes. But I'm kind of curious what you guys think.
Sure. So, and I'll add to this, the question that we got also included the election process.
And the electoral process. I want to kind of follow up with that. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to hit on both of these at the same time. Sorry. I don't think that polling and the electoral process are necessarily broken. I'll start with that. And maybe it's the communication scholar in me, but I also think this is partially a media problem and a media reporting problem. So when it comes to polls with high margins of error or polls that are misrepresented in the way that they're covered, yes, that may be a polling issue, but that's also a problem in the way that the media reports on those polls. Secondly, with the election process component, yes, there are small mistakes that come up or issues that come up in election polling locations, and those are problems on the election process side, but it's also an issue for how the media reports on those problems. And I think that media generally have made leaps and bounds in the last 4 to 8 years in the way that they are transparent, in the way that they report on polls in particular, and in their election night coverage. But I think that there are still improvements to be made in that space, and that that's something that the focus needs to be put on, is not only reporting polls, but making them digestible and interpretable to a lay audience who doesn't understand the science behind polling, or is not, doesn't have a PhD in that. So continually, improving election night graphics and improving the way that polls get reported, and improving on how we report mistakes, maybe not as catastrophes across the whole of the election process, as a means of restoring integrity.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add to that. Those are great points. Maybe I just wanted to clarify what we mean by polls in this context. So what we hear as who is projected to win before elections are actually finishing is what we call a pre-election poll, where likely voters are selected from a big population and they're asked, who do you intend to vote? And then on election day, what we read in the news is not election returns, it's what we call exit polls. So they're polls, voters will come out of the polling place, or they are called on their phone, or if they have voted early and they're asked who they voted for. Those are, they have their weaknesses, they have their strengths. but there are several challenges in finding those voters. There's a lot of research that shows that there's inequality among the population on who is more likely to respond to polls and who is more likely to respond and lie, and who is more likely to be truthful. Polling methodology is very sophisticated, but still there's always interesting dynamics in every cycle. In 2016, pollsters identified an important education component in the population that was really missing from the methodology, and that's why the polls were so off about preference for Trump. And 2020, it was race. It was white, not college-educated voters. So every election year is a reminder that pollsters learn and adapt, but at the same time, the media they want to sell. They want to sell stories. They want people to click on their links, and we have a tendency to engage with negative stories. Voters waiting 30, 40 minutes, 11 hours, some voters in Georgia. But the big story is also that there are options for them to vote. So there were so many. Maricopa County, Arizona had 20% of their locations had voting technology malfunctions yesterday, and the big story was Maricopa County voters cannot vote, and that's a crime against humanity, which of course is unfortunate. But the Secretary of State stepped in and said, you know what, those voters can actually cast a vote. They may not be able to use the machine right now, but they can vote, and their vote will be counted. So a reminder about the media playing a very big role in this ecosystem and how they interpret polls, and how they may reiterate stories and that discourage voters, and further make it very difficult for voters to trust the election process.
Yeah, I think along the same lines, back to your question about whether polling is broken or can be fixed. I think I have less confidence in voting now than I did in, say, 2005, or not voting in polls, than I did in 2005. I think they still are valuable. I think the challenges really with polls and their accuracy, like Leah was saying, one is how you construct your likely voter model. Is it going to be people of a certain age or education level or in geographic locations? And there's a certain amount of art to that, and understanding who is motivated to turn out to the polls. That's never going to be perfect. You try to learn from each election, and you try to figure that out. The other, and I think more substantive problem, is a lot of polling comes on your cell phone. Who answers calls on your cell phone from people you don't know? Probably my mom. That's it, right? That's a legitimate problem. And what you're seeing is maybe in 2005, to just throw that out there, if you had a call center that was polling, they would get a 20% response rate on these dial-out polls. Now they're getting less than 1%. And I think that makes the information, one of the great things about it is we can look afterwards. We have results and we can kind of figure out where we missed things. 538 and Nate Silver's website looks at them, kind of grades polls, and you can see you don't always know how they constructed likely voter. That's their special sauce, so they don't want to always share that. But we do have some sort of accountability when it comes to that. But it still is, it's a little bit scary when you know that it's just not the same way that we used to collect data. This has happened over time, right? When cell phones came out, there were polls that were wrong because they weren't calling cell phones. And certainly younger people, I was younger at the time, believe it or not, had a cell phone, and my parents would get a call on their own landline. Those were the phones that were in the wall. You probably never seen those. So yeah, there are challenges with it, but I think we tweak it, right? Life is part and parcel for figuring out how to improve things as you go. And it's important information. Once again, I'm a policy person. It's even important from a public policy perspective because people vote, but also their attitudes about why they vote help give administrators insight into making decisions as they carry out the wishes of the electorate. So.
I have nothing to say on whether or not polling is broken, but the next question might give you all some polling numbers, so I hope it's not.
Actually, let's move on to this. Let's move on to this next question, because we are constantly told about the problems of polarization, and Dr. Maravaki and perspective, and you, in the context of the U.S., we talked about this issue of affective polarization, where it sometimes seems that it's not so much that we vote for a candidate as much as we vote against the person that that person is running against, which can sometimes really not be a true reflection of our policy preferences. But I think one of the things that, you know, the requisite talking heads on various media are saying today is they're asking the question of whether Americans really are that divided. So I actually kind of want to put this to you. Do you think that Americans are divided? I mean, obviously there's going to be some area, but or do you think that this idea that we're so massively polarized is perhaps overstated because our political and media leaders are simply telling us that we are? Is this a facade, or is this something that actually might be real and active within our political culture? Maybe start with Dr. Kelly, because the issue pertaining to reproductive health is obviously one of those key areas.
So in the media, it absolutely looks like people are polarized into either the Democrats or the Republicans. They have no crossover. There's no room for any sort of bipartisanship. On and on and on and on. You listen to political speeches, you see the actual elected officials, and you watch a MAGA rally, and you would be convinced that we are hopelessly polarized. But, and I cannot believe as a sociologist, because all we do is talk about social problems, and I get to be the person who brings the message of hope today. It looks like abortion, or support for abortion rights, transcends party lines. There were a lot of split ticket voters who voted yesterday. So for example, Kentucky, conservative Kentucky, voted down an amendment that would have explicitly banned abortion while also re-electing the deeply conservative Rand Paul. That wouldn't make sense with this polarization narrative. 65% of Americans in general, this is coming from Pew Research, that they're pretty reliable, right? Okay, we can do this. 65% of Americans say Dobbs was a major loss of rights for women. 40% are, quote, angry or very angry about the Dobbs decision overturning Roe. 60% want a federal law ensuring a federal right to abortion prior to viability. And that statistic has been true for decades. That one just doesn't budge. Exit polls today, 3 in 10 voters overall said abortion was the most important midterm issue. Now 4 in 10 showed out for inflation. So inflation beat it out, but abortion beat crime and immigration, so we're going to take it. It was a top issue among Michigan and Pennsylvania voters, which, given how bitter the contest, or allegedly how bitter the contest between Pennsylvania's Senate election and Michigan's gubernatorial race, that was a bit surprising. So when it comes to the issue of reproductive rights and women's autonomy over their bodies, we are not nearly as polarized as our public politics would make us out to be.
Yeah, I would like to add something to that. I totally agree that my students of political behavior, we talk about how many voters identify as Democrats, but they also say they're conservative, which is very interesting because we usually conflate the two. There is consistency in American voting behavior. If they're Republicans, you're going to vote, they're not going to split the ticket usually. And of course, there's always one election where things are different than what we think we know. We're not, I don't think we are that divided, but there are signs of concern in the rhetoric around partisanship, what we call affective polarization, where we are led to think of the other side as an enemy. There's a Pew study that asks people, what do you think about Democrats, what do you think about Republicans? And the other side says they're the enemy of the people, they want to destroy the country. And they use those terms that, as if the other side is the devil. And thinking, what happened on January 6, 2021, thinking about armed people waiting outside of drop boxes in Maricopa County to observe and intimidating voters, or calling election officials and harassing them. We're going to tell you that really shows that even if the majority of Americans are not that polarized, there are some concerning patterns about what some can do that are driven from this affective polarization. And using the abortion as an example, it is striking that even before we knew that the Dobbs decision was coming, because the document was leaked, Americans predominantly were saying, we don't want this to be overturned. So we knew what Americans were feeling about this. They were more or less, the majority, at least regardless of party, they did not want Roe to be overturned. But then we had Lindsey Graham sponsoring legislation, the senator, about federal ban on abortion. So it's going to be very, very interesting moving forward to observe this major disconnect between the main ideology of voters and the ideology of elected officials, and how those cues are trickled down to the voters and how they're shaping this rhetoric around partisanship and issues. But voters are not really polarized, but the structure of the discourse and the rhetoric do create opportunities to engage one another in a very negative way and appear to be even more polarized than we might think they are.
Yeah, just a couple extra comments. The argument of the elite polarization and the sort of typical voter being the same is one that is kind of famous in political science and public administration. The scholar's name is Mo Fiorina. He's done that for a while, and he's looked at it, and what he did was he looked at attitudes, I think starting in the 70s, and how there hasn't been a major change on issues like abortion in most areas, except for maybe some normal social progression, and yet our elites, and especially the leadership of the elites, has definitely tacked and become more polarized. So that's kind of, and there's ample evidence. Y'all check it out if you're interested in it. So I do think that elites are far more polarized than typical people, but I also think that people are more polarized than we have been in a while, and I think we all feel it anecdotally, even at Thanksgiving and in our lives. So I think that's one of the things that's important to kind of think about too.
I'll just add to this. From a social media perspective, I think that campaigns capitalize on these differences that exist between people now. So the way that they can sort of tie in all of these dislikes and likes that we have as a means of showing us political campaign ads is particularly important. So in this election cycle, Facebook's rules around political advertising say that you cannot target someone on the basis of whether they have an affinity for the Democratic or the Republican Party. Instead, if you were in Texas, for example, if you were a fan of NASCAR on Facebook, you were probably likely to see an ad for Greg Abbott. If you disliked NASCAR on Facebook, you were probably likely to see an ad for Beto O'Rourke. And so political campaigns are using this information that's seemingly non-political to further slice and dice us into groups of people to show us political ads. And so I think even if those divisions are maybe not as striking as we would say here, being able to capitalize on those divisions that might exist is just selectively showing people different types of campaign information, and then may influence, we're not positive, the vote choice that they have.
Thank you. It's 4:30 right now. That means we have about a half hour. I'm going to kind of maybe not go into my third question, but rather see if there's some interest in the audience to ask our panelists questions. And if there's time remaining, I might get to my third question. But what I would like to do right now is open it up. Is there anybody in the audience who has a question that they would like to ask? Yes?
I have a question, and for any one of y'all, but do you believe that the attitude, you said that the attitude hasn't changed since like the 70s towards like abortion rights, everything. Do you think that social media and this younger generation who expresses themselves more has a big influence on those laws staying the same and us being able to vote now? Do you think that influences women's rights to abortion, to say, to be, I'm sorry, that was my question.
Are you asking if social media is keeping Gen Z in the Gen Z in the pro-choice call?
Can you use the microphone just so we're online?
I think it's definitely possible. Gen Z has, we like to characterize generations in sweeping terms. I'm Gen X, so apparently I care about nothing. But Gen Z is very socially active. They are a generation with a profound interest in social justice issues. They also are better than previous generations in many ways in tying different social justice issues, for example, abortion access and structural racism, or abortion access, structural racism, and economic inequality. they make those connections earlier and they're pretty vocal about it. So while I don't spend a ton of time on TikTok, I am the mother of a 19-year-old who incessantly sends me TikToks. And so based on that limited sample, it appears yes, but maybe I'll turn this over to the social media expert.
I think just anecdotally, the way that information, I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old son, and the way that information moves between them and their friends is much faster. And there's an interesting thing that kind of, and I have no rigorous scholarship to back this up. This is completely anecdotal, so there's a disclaimer to it. But there is a strange kind of perception of expertise in things like TikTok videos. And I can tell you that my daughter has asked me a question before and argued with me because she watched a TikTok video, and I'm like, Emily, I literally wrote a book about this. But it's on TikTok, right? So I don't know if it has an impact on reproductive rights, but I think it probably impacts everything that you see and think and how you're exposed to it. But then once again, kind of back to Dr. Collier and some of the micro-targeting information, there's also micro-targeting on TikTok, and it's pushing you. So if you're clicking on things that are pro-life or pro-choice, it's pushing you into more of those videos and reinforcing what you think. So, you know, it probably does impact what you think. I'm not sure it's convincing you to see disconfirming information or other perspectives.
I would like to know, this is a great question, and something that I have observed in the last years is more efforts to create social movements for young people to be mobilized and informed and make those connections that Dr. Kelly was talking about earlier and take action on it. The biggest challenge for your generation is that statistically young people are not likely to vote as likely as the cohorts, or they face more challenges in voting. Mississippi, for example, there's how many use an already admissive state to sign? Okay, just one or two, and the list that I have was outdated. So it a lot of problems. I don't want to go into that. A lot of challenges for young voters to actually cast a vote, and so you may have the enthusiasm, or you may be passionate about a specific issue, but the structure might not be very favorable to you participating and voicing those concerns. So there has been an effort to capitalize on this and inform young voters about the options, but also push for legislation that will make it easier for young voters to participate, which oftentimes is challenging in states like Mississippi, for example, and other more conservative states. So it is a generational interest in those issues, but at the same time more effort from the campaign side to engage the young voters and get them more active and to make the connection that those issues that we read about in the news, they affect me personally and I can do something about it, and one of those things I can do is, of course I can protest, I can call my representative, but I can also get out and vote.
Dr.
So this is a question that's sort of building off of the previous one. So, and you're all experts on this, and this is a little bit selfish because I'm working on a project and I just would love to hear your opinion about this. So I've interviewed a bunch of kids during the Trump era about their views about politics and racism, and according to what they said, they felt like America was very polarized. Like that was certainly the theme of what they said. So I guess I'm wondering what you think about for people who can't vote yet due to their age, so younger kids than anyone I think here, like growing up in this moment with all of these questions about democracy and what does that mean, and all the voting integrity, as well as these interesting this interesting thing that you mentioned, Dr. Kelly, about policy issues versus candidates and parties. I guess I'm just kind of curious. Dr. Shoup had mentioned this concept of generational imprinting to me at one point. Thank you for that. And so I guess I'm just trying to put all this in my head as a sociologist, and I'm particularly interested from some other, well, you too, Dr. Kelly, but from some other people's perspectives, what do you think about all this? What does it mean to grow up in this moment right now as a child and to be around all of this, because you can't participate yet?
This is a great question. I don't want to do have something for you that might be of interest. So there's one professor at the University and her colleagues, they did a study where they asked children about to draw a picture of who they think is a political leader. And the majority of the pictures they drew were of men. So there was a great illustration of how we are structured, our kids are structured in a system where, we think that, the first thing we think about leaders are they have to be men, or, doctors are men and nurses are women. The same applies to race. And, living in the South, my brother told me a story about a class, and a classmate of hers was a pink shirt, and he was very proud of it. Today I got a pink shirt for, over the break, and a classmate of his shouted, "Oh, you're gay." And that was so eye-opening to me because I thought, those are conversations that our kids are listening from how we grow up in our households, and then they carry over. So it is very interesting to see how these pressures from society and our interactions, how they might be what we call cross-pressure from our households in conservative societies like Mississippi. That's where I'm living at the moment, so that's what I can speak of. And how they can really create those moments for kids, and then when they grow up, they're very, very, we call them cross-pressure in political science, that I've been growing up thinking like this, but I see other things, and it's making me very hard to determine what I'm supposed to be doing. But it is undeniable that children are growing in a structure where even implicitly they are given those stereotypes or those things that what they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be thinking, and then when they go out into the real world, they go to college, they realize that maybe I don't know what I'm supposed to think right now. I have been voting Democratic with my parents, or I have been voting Republican, and now I don't agree with this, but I'm supposed to be voting Republican. What am I supposed to do? How can I betray my my parents or my party? Very, very difficult decisions. I don't think I have a solution to this, but I think it's we do have evidence that this happens, and it's part structural, but also within the household. So printing, socialization, and things like that.
I know nothing about children.
Does anybody else have a question? Dr. Williams.
What does voting look like in 20 years from now in terms of the actual act? I noticed that yesterday I passed my vote, and then after that I went to actually stand with some of the candidates who were standing outside their polling place. And West Hartwell precinct had theirs in Sportsplex at the same moment that a soccer tournament was going on. And so access was very chaotic. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, there's a little belt that runs through the middle of Georgia where I grew up. Last election that went blue when it's usually red. And I start thinking about my parents that COVID has basically made them housebound. They won't leave. I've never known my parents to cast an absentee or ask for a mail-in. Cobb County, if you were looking at that, Cobb County forgot to mail out 1,000 ballots to people who requested mail-in votes. So, what do other countries look like in terms of how they do their elections? Is it always an election day? Do they open it up? What do you think our election process looks like in the future?
I think Dr. Lee
I will answer that. Yeah, I study election administration, so this is very close to my heart. Cobb County didn't have that problem, so over 1,000 voters were not mailed their absentee in time. There was a court order to allow them to return, so they were sent new ballots, and the court order said that they can submit them and postmark them, so mail them by election day, and they will be counted, they will be returned. But
even talking, I hate to interrupt you, but even talking to some political operatives on the ground in Atlanta yesterday, they were FedExed their ballot, and they basically have 24 hours to get it completed and back. You can't do drop boxes on certain days, so you had to have a postmark, so that meant that someone who's housebound has 24 hours to get to a
agree. So with over 8,000 jurisdictions, errors are bound to happen. So we wouldn't be completely unrealistic to say that issues like that don't happen. Now, there are voters, even one voter, if they're affected, it's too much for me. Every voter has an opportunity. The challenge with the example you're describing is that for those decisions to be made, let's say for the state to say, just go to any Dropbox, we're going to open all Dropboxes available, we're going to come to you, it oftentimes requires state legislative action. And state legislators, since 2020, have been trying to curtail the power of secretaries of state to make those decisions. So it is very difficult to actually open up access in the last minute, and that's obviously a problem. The same happened in Florida with some counties that were impacted by Hurricane Ian, and or in California with the rain in some California counties. Now, what voting is going to look like in the future? Voting by email is not going to go away. It is secure. We have been doing it for years for verified voters and overseas voters. That's how it started. So efforts from some Republican campaigns to invalidate ballots in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, that would mean that our military voters would not get to have their votes counted, it is a crime. So mail voting will stay in place. Voting on Tuesday is a challenge, but that has been the case in the United States. In other countries, I'm from Greece, we vote on Sunday. Voting used to be mandatory, not anymore, because the fines that we're supposed to have, we're not even voting at all. But there's a culture of voting over time. So options to vote are going to stay. That's what it's going to look like. We're not going to do online voting because that's not secure no matter what we hear, so don't be afraid about that. But the persistent challenges are those who make laws about elections do not know how elections are run. And that is a big challenge because after 2020, there's a lot of changes in the voting mail policy that made it even harder for voters to be able to vote. And we did see in Texas, the Texas primary, voters who were using this method to vote years and years, they had their ballots invalidated because of the changes the state legislatures made. So it's not only fraud because fraud by mail does not exist, and states have those safeguards. So we can learn from other states, but of course the United States has a unique system. It's federalized, elections are run by the states. The federal government can say tomorrow, every state is going to have automatic registration, early voting, mail voting. That's going to be disastrous because every state does it differently. And it's very difficult to implement all the overhauling changes, and none of the states do it. So far, what we know from federal policy is that states have their own ways, their own challenges. There's not a limited funds, so we're going to have problems. But what we have to make sure is that those options that are on the books, we improve them. There are ways to do it, and there are ways to keep elections secure and make sure that every eligible voter can cast their ballot, especially when there is circumstances that either natural disasters or errors, because unfortunately they're humans. Those errors happen. We have to find ways to resolve them and maintain the elections. I hope that answers your question.
Any other questions from the audience? Dr. Long? No, by all means, please.
Dr. King mentioned how California has voter information package that gets sent out, and kind of going on his question, do you think voting would change necessarily if all states had things like voter information packages come out?
I actually can tell you, one of the things that I've recommended to family and friends are apps like ActiVote and these other sorts of things. They're not partisan. They don't tell you who to vote for. They say this is where you vote. If you put in they'll go right to your Secretary of State's office and they'll tell you where you go to vote. They'll tell you who's running and what elections, and they'll tell you when they happen. You know, in the United States, I think one of the big failings we have is we think, really up until a couple years ago, we think we just vote every 4 years, and then people start realizing we have midterms. I mean, I've told my students, Lauren was in, I guess, Lester in a class just yesterday, and I tell them all the time, the most important elections are it's your board of aldermen, it's your county board of directors, it's your governor. If you don't know the name of the person who goes to your state capitol and represents you in your state legislature or the Senate, you've got a problem. Because those are the people who really have the most outsized influence over the legislative structure that guides your day-to-day life. And that's just true.
Kind of echoing what Brian's saying, the other really important election because especially when you look at federal House races, we have gotten so scientific about redistricting nowadays that there are very few truly competitive House districts. So the determinations are made in the primaries. You think about this congressional district that we're in right here. The big election wasn't yesterday for Congressman Guest, it was the primary. And they had to have the runoff, and so you have, and those tend to be very small numbers of people who are involved and very low information. So that's one of the challenges too.
Dr. Lowen and then Dr. Klein.
So this is sort of exactly what I was going to ask about. I think like Dr. Williams brought up voter access as being one of the main obstacles that people were worried about, in particular in the lead up to this election. But then the other side of that is gerrymandering. And in a lot of the media coverage, it was almost like a kind of apocalyptic or catastrophic characterization that gerrymandering over the last several cycles has basically tipped the scales in favor of one party to the detriment of the other. So I was surprised by yesterday's election results. And I wonder if anyone on the panel can talk about the role you think gerrymandering did or did not end up playing in what we saw in these midterm elections.
This is something that I remember in 2010, or I guess it was 2011, doing a radio interview and talking about, I was in North Carolina, and most of the time the redistricting occurs after the census, so every 10 years. And part of it is a technological thing. We've just got such accurate information, like Dr. Collier was saying, that we know a scary amount about individual voters. When people knock on your door, they have all kinds of micro-targeting information. So you can make really precise districts. But the other, I think the side of it that's optimistic is we're also seeing a lot more redistricting reform. I think people know that it's a problem, and there are a lot of places that have good solutions, and they're doing bipartisan redistricting commissions and trying to take some of that out of it.
I would like to add to that the one concerning case at the moment is the hearing, the new hearing called the Independent State Legislature. So it originated in North Carolina. The courts there deemed their district, the new designs, heavy gerrymandered. The Supreme Court said that you cannot racially gerrymander, so you cannot discriminate only on race, but partisan gerrymander with the specific grounds is okay, so we're not going to touch it. So the state court, Supreme Court of North Carolina said that's unconstitutional, there is extreme gerrymander, the Republicans are suing, it's going to the Supreme Court, they have hearings about it, that might transform how elections are run in the United States. In North Carolina, we have Republicans running the state, and the Supreme Court is still being Republican, and election experts are very concerned about what this will mean for redistricting, because they have to redesign their districts. Now, since 2010, that was the most excessive nationwide gerrymandering we had experienced that really tilted the scale. And we see that in state legislatures. We may not see it excessively at the federal level when we vote for Congress, but when we observe those voters where they live and how many of the states are red and they're run by Republicans, because parties, the state legislature in power, they are in most states in terms of redistricting. So obviously, and if partisan redistricting is allowed, they're going to do it. So that really brings a lot of context when we understand enthusiasm, Democrats voting, let's say, to gain seats, and why there's still this tilt over the Republican side, particularly across the states.
Yeah, I actually studied gerrymandering, or I did in my initial part of my academic career, in a comparative context, as particularly looking at places like Malaysia, where you had a Malay majority, but it wasn't that big, and it was attempting to insulate its political power. There is a risk of gerrymandering, that happens. It can blow up in your face, because what you're attempting to do is to guarantee a maximum number of seats that you control. But in order to do that, you have to take some voters from your group and put them here. So what you're doing is you're winnowing the majority that you might be guaranteed to win, but you rely on it. And in a low interest election, or if there is some sort of wedge issue that violates or breaks that in any conceivable way, what you believed was a non-overcomable boundary that your opponent had to get actually can break pretty quickly. And to be perfectly honest, that's kind of one of the things that helped Trump in 2016, were districts that I thought Democrats thought they had carved for themselves. But it was working class people who felt, look, the factory in Toledo where I work got shut down, and you don't care about it. And so it immediately flipped that. And that's, Buddha said, the only thing that is inevitable is change. Or the only permanent thing is change. That's a dynamic there.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you began by observing that normally in an off-year election, the out party picks up about 40 seats. A couple of things. One, with a diminishing number of winnable seats, there's a ceiling, as it were, of the number of seats that theoretically could be captured by the Republicans. The others, so one side Democrat, and vice versa for the Democrats. And the other thing is that picking up 40 seats depends where you're starting. And in 2020, Republicans, Biden was elected, but Republicans picked up seats in
Right.
So there were a lot of Democrats swept into office with Biden, who then got knocked off yesterday. The same thing in 2000 and 2002, Bush didn't bring in a bunch of Republicans, and so he actually picked up seats in 2002. So the 40-seat thing depends a lot on what the current level of the out party is.
Yeah, that speaks to a lot of motivating dynamics, I think, and I would obviously kind of defer to you guys on that. Anybody have thoughts on that? What accounts for that kind of minimization of the amount of seats? Like is a 20-seat pickup now considered a wave?
Well, what I will know is that, we were trying to expect a red wave, a red surge, and then, then we realized, well, it wasn't that big of a surge anyway, but there's still many races to call. It really depends. There are high incumbency rates, but overall, in the last decades, what we have experienced is high turnover anyway, so the margins are very, very narrow. Control of the House and the Senate is often, a small number of seats, and there's so many contextual factors as well. And maybe 20 might seem a lot, but at the same time, it might not seem a lot. But overall, we have so many high incumbency rates, and in some instances, there are, candidates are vulnerable. There's a scandal brewing, and that gives an opportunity to challengers. But there's also important dynamics in whether women are required to run, or quality candidates to run, or opportunities to just, flood money and unseat unfavorable elected officials, or if Trump, endorses you, that's your way in. So there's so many contextual factors we can really capture with those statistics, and every election year we always see, but it is, as you know, it was predictable that, the Republicans would earn no seats.
And I think along the same, like Dr. Fight was saying, you generally see open seats. Somebody retires and that's the seat that changes party. Looking at it, and incumbents, there's such an advantage to incumbency in House races. There are very few incumbents who, I was just looking, Maloney lost. Let's see, Luria in Virginia. Did she lose that?
She did.
Last I saw was she was 92% in. So they tend to be lightning rods, right? Gloria is on the January 6th. Maloney was DCCC, and Boebert is everywhere, right? So those are very unusual circumstances. So they're usually open, and somebody retires. So the actual competitive knocking off incumbents is really tough.
We have time for one question.
Hi, with so many independent party candidates on the ballot this year, netting to even 9% in some states, do you think there's any chance in the nearish future, 20 years, for proportional representation in the United States?
Not at the federal level, but we have seen states adopting ranked choice voting, experimenting with proportional. There have been some Supreme Court decisions in the past, precedents that kind of make it difficult to implement proportional representation. based on Voting Rights Act precedent, but states are experimenting with RCV, so that could be ranked choice voting, so that could be something, but at the federal level it seems anything that can really disadvantage the party power, and then, passing a policy at the federal level is a challenge, especially in elections and allocation of seats, so, but maybe more states are going to do that.
Yeah, and I think the same, we have a duopoly, right? This is the way we teach it in Intro to American Politics, or state and local government. And the political parties work with the state governments in how elections and all of these systems work. So it's very difficult to shake those two parties out of the system and even have a viable third party candidate, even though there may be space for like a centrist party in our system. It feels like there is. It would just be really tough everything goes through the parties and they work in consultation, like together, to make sure that these systems all work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's really only one country that's made a successful switch from majoritarian first past the post system to a PR system in the past 25 years. That's New Zealand. It's a very, very, very hard switch to make. All right. First of all, I don't know if anybody here has a closing statement they would like to make. We only have a couple of minutes, so it would have to be a nice short thing, like, I don't know.
I want to say on behalf of Dr. Kelly, I don't want to speak for her, but you mentioned that the ray of hope, the sunshine, those red states, thanks to direct democracy ballot initiative, voters were able to express or to force decision on the ballot. Because state legislatures, they would not do it. They would not put a referendum for voters, but they put it on the ballot, they collected the signatures, and this speaks volumes about voter enthusiasm, and if they have the tool, they will use it. So I think that's a great message for, your question before about young voters, those exist. It's important to take advantage of them and force the legislators to make the decisions that they may conveniently ignore.
I would like to build on that. I think there's a couple, we didn't get to the big lesson takeaway, but for the GOP, they have put themselves in a tough corner because extremist abortion positions like no exemptions for rape, incest, life endangerment of the pregnant person, it wins them primaries, but then it freaks voters out in the general election and they vote down these anti-abortion initiatives. For the Democrats, I think they have found a way forward. SCOTUS, it's a 6-3, very conservative majority. We will not see a federal right to abortion reestablished anytime in the next few decades, likely. But with these voter initiatives that Dr. Mary Bakke was just talking about, there were 6 proposed pro-choice initiatives. 3 got on the state ballots, met their state's requirements, all passed. In contrast, there were 8 proposed anti-abortion initiatives, and only 2 got the voter support to make it to the ballot, and they were both defeated. So I think Democrats need to realize that this grassroots approach, appealing to the voters, can move the needle on the issue of reproductive rights and probably some other things. They should think about this. But the reasons voters were so upset about abortion is, I can't believe that my daughter has fewer rights than her mother or grandmother. This is inappropriate for the conservatives. This is inappropriate government intrusion into healthcare and personal decisions. And then, of course, some of you are just worried about the lack of access for healthcare. This is going to kill people. Some of the things that are being proposed. Pay attention. There's room. Clearly, when we look at conservative states defeating anti-abortion measures, and we look at reliable polling data about how people feel, there is lots of room to cross the aisle. Like a particularly fertile group might be young Republican women. They're going to be conservative on other things, but they do not care for this. And I think the Democrats have a chance of actually moving the needle state by state if they get a bit savvier about their voter outreach.
You throw marijuana legalization in there, which is very popular. Those are the big, nonpartisan issues, right? I used to always teach and talk, well, we can't agree on anything. And then we go, how many here think marijuana should be legalized? And the whole class puts their hand down.
Maryland, they legalized something they go to the next to that.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I had my own thoughts on these things, but if the hippie lettuce is what you prefer, each his own, I guess. I'm a single